Well, I guess we will go ahead and get started. My name is Amy Cleaver, and I am a second-year medical student here at the University of Oklahoma. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hwang. Dr. Hwang is an assistant professor in the Department of Occupational and Environmental Health at the Hudson College of Public Health. She received her Ph.D. in Industrial Hygiene and her M.S. in Environmental Health Sciences from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Hwang was a postdoctoral fellow at the Division of Cancer Epidemiology and Genetics, National Cancer Institute, National Institute of Health. Her research has focused on evaluating the relationships between occupational exposure to specific contaminants and adverse health effects in several different industries, including mining, agriculture, and manufacturing. Dr. Hwang will be speaking on health risks to firefighters of smoke from climate change. Before we get started, if you could please turn your cameras on so we could facilitate a more welcoming discussion, that would be great. And Dr. Hwang will let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Amy, for your nice introduction. So thank you so much again for having me. This is a great opportunity. So today we will discuss the health risk of smoke for firefighters and the impact of climate change on the health risk. So let me start my talk with an overview. So we will begin by discussing the strong connection between the wildfires and climate change. Then we will discuss exposures from smoke and wildfires, and then impact of mixed pollutants on the firefighters' health. And finally, I will briefly introduce our ongoing studies on firefighters' health. So let's take a look at the consequences of the wildfires. So the epidemiological studies estimated that the global mortality burden attributable to landscape fire smoke is about 340,000 deaths annually. And in this country, United States, over 10 million individuals were estimated to have experienced unhealthy air quality associated with more than 10 days of exposure to wildfires. So this number is just only for the 5 years between the 2008 and 2012. And in 2020, a wildfire in California was also ranked the second most costly natural catastrophe of the year, following only Hurricane Laura. So as a matter of fact, this number is only the tip of the iceberg, as I've shown here. So estimated indirect losses are assumed to be much, much larger. So broadly speaking, the risk of wildfire is increased due to two factors: the climate change and the wildland-urban interface. So the first contributing factor is climate change. So due to the climate change, the landscape conditions have become hotter and drier. Thus, the intensity of a wildfire is greater. And the fire season is definitely, that's why it's longer. So thus, we see more frequent wildfires because of the likelihood or probability of the wildfire has increased. So the second contributing factor is wildland-urban interface, or WUI. So WUI is an area or zone in which structures and other human developments meet with undeveloped wildfire fields. So let's take a look at further each factor in a minute. So actually climate change has arrived already. Some leading media have changed their terminology to refer to a climate crisis, which better describe the broader impact of climate change, global warming, and the consequences. So I'm just showing the example of some of the newspaper here. So from the local newspaper to AP News. So it has become more common from the news media in this country and around the world to report on wildland fire being fought because of the climate change. So strikingly, the fires are described as a record-breaking, whether by size of the burn, level of emissions, or even number of fatalities every year. So the climate change alteration in wind patterns, temperature, and the level of moisture around the globe affect the likelihood and the magnitude of wildfires. So changes in the climate or weather patterns, including drought, are increasing the risk of wildland fires and the risk of comorbidity. So for the considerable number of news agencies around the world, the fight against the wildland fires has become daily news. So in 2015, the Paris Agreement was established to limit global warming and climate change. So since then, world leaders in science, economic, politics, and so on from 38 different academic institutions and UN agencies have all collaborated on the report. It's called the Lancet Countdown here. So this annual report describes the emerging health profile of the changed climate. So now it's our 5th report published in 2021 last year. That's the most current version. So the 2021 report presents 43 indicators across 5 areas here. So one of those areas, climate change impact, exposure, and the vulnerabilities, addresses all aspects of firefighting we will discuss today. So wildfire, smoke exposure, and the wildland firefighters respectively. And I'm now showing another map. It's on this map, the color code indicates here the change in the number of the days of exposure to risk of wildfire. So here the red means increasing risk and the blue means decreasing risk. So the change is measured between 2 time periods, between 2016 and 2019 and 2001 and 2004. So the authors found that the 114 out of 196 countries, nearly which is 60%, had an increase in the number of days people were exposed to very high or extremely high fire danger in 2016 and 2019 compared with the 2001 and 4. And about 3/4, 72% of countries have increased human exposure to wildfire across the world. In particular, as you can see in Africa here. However, no studies have investigated the firefighters' exposures to wildfire on this continent. So now I'm showing the fire, not just the wildfire, but fire instance map in the United States as detected by NASA's satellite here. So NASA affirms Fire Information for Resource Management System uses satellite observations of fire radiative power, or FRA. So FRA is a measure of the radiative heat output of a fire. So here, each red dot indicates a spot where one of the NASA's satellites detected a fire over the past month. So awfully, even though it was a fire season, but this map only covers 1 month, last month actually. So broadly speaking, there are 3 types of the fires: so wildland fire, WUI, and the structural. So wildland fire involves the vegetation or natural fuels, and structural fires occur in a building, whether private, residential, commercial, or industrial. And wildland urban interface, or WUI fire, is a hybrid of the other 2 types, in which fire is burning homes, structure, and thereby consuming man-made materials in addition to natural fuels. So as I mentioned earlier, WUI is one of the factors contributing to an increase in wildfires. Another angle, what we can see is a duration of the wildland or WUI fire, and the amount of the smoke produced influenced by the type of the vegetation. So as here, the color coded here, very generally, natural fuel fires can be classified into 3 large diverse categories. So here, grass or desert brush or shrub or forest here. The fires burning grass fuels tend to spread quickly and burn out very quickly. So fires burning brush fuels can burn hot and spread fast if the weather conditions are right. So fires burning forest fuels can range from slow moving to rapid spreading. And long-lasting fires burning this type of fuel tend to produce the most intense and prolonged smoke. But smoke can cause problems from the wildfires using all fuel types. So here's a table show which state is at risk. So Oklahoma here is ranked in the top 10 wildfire-prone states by estimated number and by percentage of the properties at risk. So over 150,000 properties, or 9% have a high to extreme wildfire risk. So now let's take a look at the comparison of a wildfire and a prescribed fire. So here what I meant wildfire means to an emergency or unplanned fire occurring in vegetation or using natural fuels. However, the prescribed fire are pre-planned fire using natural fuels that are allowed to burn to achieve a resource management goal. So on the left here, chart shows that over the last decades, between 2011 and 2021, so more than everything more than the 82 million acres were burned and destroyed in the 660,000 wildfires that occurred. On the right side here, the chart shows a much clearer pattern of the increase in prescribed fire, indicating that more efforts at fuel management were made. So increasing the number of described fire to manage it rather than aggressively suppress wildfire can promote adaptive resilience as the climate continues to warm. So the annual appropriation for wildland fire is also part of an overall federal budget from Congress. Congress funds all wildland fire related activities on land administered by the Department of Interior and managed by the Office of Wildland Fire. So there are 4 bureaus involved in managing wildland fires: Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildfire Service. And here, U.S. Forest Fire, federal agency under Department of Agriculture, is also involved. As shown on left, U.S. Congress appropriation on wildfire fluctuate annually, but trends upwards and is projected to be further increased. In the fiscal years 2011 and 2020, which is the same period of time what we just saw on last slides, so Congress appropriated $45 billion for wildfire management. And in particular, the fiscal year 2022 appropriation was over $6 billion, the highest appropriation to date. So let me switch gears. This photo and the comment, so I'm not gonna read this comment, but this posted by Drew Dobby struck me. And I started asking myself how firefighters' health can be improved. Smoke is the most obvious product of wildland fires and results from the incomplete combustion of forest fuels, which are carbon-based compounds, both inorganic and organic. As the smoke interacts with the atmosphere, intermediate chemicals are formed, which we consider the part of the smoke. So in fact, the health risk posed to wildland fires from smoke have been recognized for the last 30 years. It's not just a couple of years ago. So health relevant occupational exposure to smoke have been measured during fire suppression. Since then, it has been well documented that wildfire smoke is comprised of many individual pollutants, including carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter 2.5, and more. And same researchers have also found that fire smoke is associated with a decrease in lung function and increase in airway responsiveness. So one example of the pollutant found in wildfire smoke is particulate matter. So this figure shows the estimated air pollutant levels after the wildfire occurred, compiled from several studies. So here, all the x-axis is all the different studies, and the y-axis is actually the level of the PM2.5, the concentration. And this horizontal line is indicating the EPA, US EPA, the standard, which is a national ambient air quality standard for 24 hours, which is 35 microgram per cubic meter. So as you can see, the most studies actually exceeded this horizontal line, which is not good. So now I'm showing the wide variety of adverse health effects attributed to wildfire smoke density or wildfire particulate matter. So you can see the health outcomes side by side here. So from the bottom, responses range from asymptomatic, subclinical, biological, and physiological responses affecting a large number of exposed individuals to smaller number indicating worse clinical manifestations requiring the use of medication or healthcare system, and even resulting in death. And here, this on the right side is a summary list of the result of health studies of wildfire smoke. So similarly, from the top, the association between the wildfire smoke density and the adverse health effects are the best defined for mortality, hospitalization, and the emergency department utilization because of the accessibility of that health data. And that's why it's easier to measure. On the other hand, the assessment of the full public health impact and the societal burden of wildfire emissions are not known because the data corresponding to symptoms contributing to impaired function, biomarkers, and biospecimen samples are not readily available. So let's take a look at one of the studies more closely from the previous slides. So the research group estimated the risk of lung cancer and the cardiovascular disease based on the PM4, which is a respirable size of the particulate matter measurements. So they considered the 4 factors here: exposure concentration, daily shift duration, breathing rate, and the years of experience as a firefighter. And the risk of cardiovascular disease rose steadily as a career length of firefighters increased here, while the risk of lung cancer increased very sharply. So depending on the years of experience and the duration of the season, the increased risk for firefighters can be 43% for lung cancer here, and 30% for the cardiovascular disease. So our understanding of exposure to contaminants and wildfire is very extensive for last 30 years. However, evidence-based studies so far have been inconclusive regarding adverse health effects because they do not use a control population or study long-term effects. An exposure assessment is that's why the foremost step. Most previous studies of health effects use questionnaires, secondary databases, mathematical modeling, or even the remote sensors to investigate exposure response or those response estimates. The resulting exposure profiles lack accuracy and detail, which leads to exposure misclassification. So we need a comprehensive health relevant exposure assessment in the field for direct measurements and monitoring. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I will introduce our ongoing firefighter cancer study. So this study mainly focuses on the structural firefighters and has two aims. So first, we will associate the dimer and the plasma pH, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon associated microRNAs, and with the pH on turnout gear and on the skin of a firefighter. So to do so, we evaluate the chemical pH exposure levels on gear, their clothing, and their skin. And then second, the purpose of the biological uptake and epigenetics, we will determine the occupational risk factors of before and after fire activities for the skin cancer. So there are many types of cancer are significantly associated with the firefighting. So for example, the summary risk estimates show 1.31 times greater risk of malignant melanoma among firefighters. And the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, has linked chemicals such as pH. So benzo A pyrene, which is a carcinogenic to human, and the benzo A anthracene, the probably carcinogenic to human, are part of a pH. And then EU also has listed the pH as a priority research chemical. So studies on cancer, skin cancer among firefighters have found that the pH on skin is correlated with the DNA strand break levels in PBMC among Danish firefighters. And the risk of skin melanoma is elevated in younger firefighters, while risk of non-melanoma skin cancer is elevated in older firefighters in Nordic countries. In the United States, the prevalence of skin melanoma cancer among younger firefighters is 6.4 times higher than that among the general population. And another studies of US firefighter cohort have also found a significantly increased risk of melanoma. So pH can enter our body through the smoke inhalation and the thermal absorption. That's our two main exposure routes. And the pH contains a very well-known carcinogens, mutagens, teratogens, and pH metabolites that can damage the human DNA. So the turnout gear is a firefighter's protective clothing. As you can see, this is all called the turnout gear. However, most available gear is developed to protect against the fire or temperature, not necessary for the chemicals like a pH. So the gear itself becomes a potential source of exposure due to gases or particles deposited after the fire activities. So as a researcher, we advocate to firefighters that dirty gear like this is not a badge of honor anymore. So in this country, there are two types of firefighters that I should explain. So about 70% of 1.2 million firefighters are volunteers. That means they have their own job. They have their own like a primary job, but they are actually volunteering as a firefighters for their community. So this pattern, the majority of volunteers shows stronger in Oklahoma. Like 92% of 743 registered fire departments across 77 counties are mostly or fully staffed by volunteer firefighters. And similarly, according to pension and retirement system, 64% of firefighters in Oklahoma are volunteer, and 36% is a career. And on the bottom of this picture, I'm showing those the volunteer fire departments. And then here on the left is urban states. So it's even though the same volunteer fire departments, but they have more resources, as you can see, the more fancy fire trucks and newer gears available, while rural states and the smaller communities here is a very of resources and even manpower, the firefighters. So to recruit our study participants, firefighters, in our campus, we had the Science Center and then Oklahoma State University research team. We have developed a mutual partnership for research activities with the Oklahoma firefighters. So this map indicates the participating fire departments across this state, Oklahoma. So as mentioned, this endeavor of recruiting firefighters and any research activities are working with all different parties. And our inclusion criteria for participants are they have to be firefighters, either career or volunteer, and they have participated in live fire suppression activities because we are actually comparing the two different scenarios, like a before and after fire activities. And they have to have their own personal turnout gear. And the research group found that the microRNA expression associated with the cancer pathway indicated the differences between the incumbent and the new firefighters. So they actually grouped the two different groups based on their experience as a firefighters. So specifically here, the microRNAs demonstrated a statistically significant decrease in expression in incumbent firefighters. So these microRNAs are tumor suppressors associated with the cancer sites from the brain to the lung. And these 3 microRNAs below demonstrates that increased the expression in incumbent. So these microRNAs are cancer promoters of the gastric and colorectal cancers. So to fully understand the exposures to pH, so our group is currently conducting a meta-analysis. So let me briefly summarize the first part of the meta-analysis. So following a systematic review process, we identified the 20 articles that were eligible for the meta-analysis. So as shown the map here, the studies were predominantly conducted in North America and Europe. And for the meta-regression analysis, pH were grouped using the IARC, International Agency for Research on Cancer Hazard Classification. So we compared the time duration of the fire suppression. So one of our findings was that the mean of the pH levels over a short time period ranged from 0.58 to 3.83 micrograms per cubic meter, while the mean over longer time period ranged from 23.58 to 49 micrograms per cubic meter, up to 40 times the differences. So the meta-regression confirmed the statistically significant increase in pH concentrations over longer duration across all IARC classification. We also look at the normal routes by the skin location in studies that provided enough record to estimate the pH means. So NEC had the very significant fold change, which is a ratio of the pH means between the pre and the post-fire activity. So the NEC is the only location where the PPE hood provides a minimal protection with a double layer of a proposed flame resistant fabric. So that's why no built-in vapor barrier. Also, the NEC is very thin, so it tends to absorb a pH more quickly. So in summary of today's my discussion is as climate change worsens, health risk from wildfire smoke increase. And firefighters are directly exposed to mixture pollutants of fire smoke during fire suppression. However, we still don't know enough of long-term health impacts of mixture pollutants. And so that's why we need an evidence-based exposure assessment in the field to determine the exposure dose relationships in large epidemiological studies of occupational risk factors. So, finally, I'd like to thank to my collaborators here at the OUHSC and my colleagues from OSU, Oklahoma State University, and the firefighters, and participating their studies and willingness to actually participate in our study. And then I also would like to thank to the funding agencies. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Hwang. That was very informative and interesting. We're going to now transition in the last 5 minutes to a time of question and answer. If you do have a question, would you please turn on your video screen so that we can all see your beautiful faces? If not, I have a couple questions for you, Dr. Hwang.
Sure.
Okay, so the first one, do you happen to know if in Oklahoma firefighters are unionized and are able to demand compensation for their future adverse health outcomes?
The compensation, right? Yeah. So that's actually as a researcher, we try to advocate, have a more, the benefits for the firefighters, especially the volunteer firefighters. So I actually don't know in Oklahoma, but some of the rural states, like my collaborators located in the Kentucky or the other states, they have about $1,000 or $2,000 for the compensation for their annual, on the basis of the annual. But that's what I know. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And then Evan, do you want to ask the next one?
Yeah, well, I actually had another question. Do you think that the impact of this smoke exposure is going to be more pronounced in rural areas as opposed to urban? I know that you were talking about how the equipment disparity is pretty apparent in larger cities versus not. I just didn't know if that was going to be something you expected to see.
Yeah, so that's actually treating me a little bit different, more complicated actually the scenarios. So in urban areas, it has a more likely to have a structural fire fighting, which is, I will say, more toxic chemicals, because we are actually literally living with all the synthetic materials. But as opposed to the urban states or urban cities, like rural areas, they have a more likely the wildfires situated there. So that means more natural fuels, as I mentioned earlier, or vegetations, those environment. So that's a little bit less. That's not really. That's a definitely lower concentration in terms of the toxic. So it's a little bit complicated to answer very simple answer. But hopefully this my answer is providing some information.
Yeah, from what I understand, it's people in more urban, they may have access to better equipment, but they're also going to be exposed to more dangerous chemicals or more dangerous toxins, while in the more rural areas, they're getting these less toxic fires, even if they're less protected from them. Thank you very much.
Kind of going off of that, I think we might have a question in the chat. Let me see. Yes, we do have a question in the chat. Someone asked, why does it seem that younger firefighters seem to have substantially higher risks of certain cancers compared to older? They say, I would have assumed older would have had more exposure since they've been firefighters for longer.
Yeah, actually the paper did not really describe really why is, the younger firefighters has a more likely the skin cancer, but that's a very good question, because I think because of the confounding factors which we do not see very clearly. For example, like a UV sunlight, or they maybe have a more likely to the outdoor activities as opposed to the older firefighters. But but the authors actually did not really provide the full information, but that's what I actually can think about the confounding factors for those, two factors like UV sun and maybe the outdoor activities. Yeah.
I actually had another question about like smoke exposure. So we've been learning in our most recent class that like smoking, like cigarette smoking can cause an increase in things like bladder cancer because of toxins filtering through your body, ending up in your bladder. Does cigarette smoking have like a similar mechanism as like exposure to wildfire and structural fires?
Yeah, smoking actually definitely is a very important to include or exclude, as a criteria. So especially what we are looking at is a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon pH, which is definitely the confounding factors for the pH. So that's why we actually excluded all the smokers, because we don't actually see any complications between this smoking habit or their current smoking status with the environmental exposures or environmental or occupational exposures at the fire suppression. So yeah, we actually carefully designed for the study, but definitely the exposure route, especially the inhalation of the smoking is, I think it's a very similar mechanisms, but we still don't know enough about the occupational exposures to the especially the wildland fire smoke at this moment. Yeah. So I do understand the smoking, like a cigarette, even or electronic cigarette, that has been studied a lot. But the occupational and environmental exposures is a kind of baby step right now. So yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Also, I forgot to put that out there. If anyone would prefer to send a direct message to me in the chat and I can ask the question that you have, please feel free to do that. I think we have time for a couple more. Do you think wildfires can be prevented, or are they an irreversible outcome of climate change?
Yeah, that's all we hope, right? But unfortunately, we actually project to have a larger size of the burn and much bigger scale of the fire burn. So because the climate change or climate crisis is not going to stop in a couple of years or maybe decades. So unless we have to input a lot of our efforts to to stop the climate change, this unfortunately the wildfire is gonna be continuously increasing. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And then I just was wondering, just like with recent Oklahoma City news, I know that giant apartment building that was being built on like Classen burned down, unfortunately. Do you just have any like comments or observations on that?
I was very sad with that's a really nice apartment, right? Yeah. But yeah, that's actually very rare in this state, actually. Yeah. But I was actually very focusing on the smoke generated from the fire suppression, because that's actually what we are doing currently right now in our study. So so what I can actually tell is that the smoking is not just for the firefighters or their exposures, but also the community in terms of think about the community around that areas. Because of the plume or the smoke, it's not going to go away until the strong winds or some the weather parameters is actually impact on the smoke in the atmosphere. So I think that's why it's very hard to avoid all these situations. Yeah, but but we try to stop all this type of the consequences. So as a health scientist and the environmental exposure assessor, our focus is just trying to see the health impacts from those fire smoke. But my colleague from the Oklahoma State University, they are actually putting more efforts on the fire science or fire technology, which is based on their design, how to reduce this type of the causing the, the fire.
Wow, that was very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Hwang. Well, I think I'm just going to leave the space open for if anybody else has a last minute question. If not, thank you so much, Dr. Hwang. And everybody else, you can feel free to leave the breakout room and go join the main room or the main session to go to your next breakout session. Dr. Hwang, once again, thank you so much for everything that you said. It was very informative, and I think we've learned a lot of things that we can take into our real life practice.
Thank you so much.
Else,
yeah.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.